So the Living Planet Index measures the differences in animal populations, groups of the same animals across the world, using information gathered from satellite images, animal trapping, camera traps, GPS tracking, and even monitoring animal dung. So there's a lot of sources. And what we do is that we use that Living Planet Index with other measures of biodiversity. It's studied by our scientists from WWF and the Zoological Society of London. And then we draw conclusions from that. And then we publish those and steps to guide our action in the Living Planet report. And that is what was produced yesterday. So it is an early warning indicator on the health of nature. And this year's edition has analyzed almost 32,000 populations of 5,230 species, with actually more than 838 new species and just over 11,000 added since the previous report came out in 2020.
What are the main drivers of this plummeting of wildlife population around the world?
So the main drivers remain really overexploitation of wild species and destruction of habitats, the deforestation of tropical forests, the unsustainable hunting and poaching or harvesting for subsistence or trade, overfishing and bycatch in our oceans, land use conversion, of course, for agriculture and other activity. And actually, it's also the wildlife corridors. The corridors are those habitats that allow wildlife to move freely, that are now being converted into fragmented systems using intensive agriculture, logging, transportation, human settlement, mining, you name it. And that's really reducing the space that is available for wildlife to roam.
And the report talks about the double emergency of climate and loss of biodiversity. Can you elaborate on that?
Climate change is driving biodiversity loss. And the report shows in many places that some species are going extinct or are decreasing due to climate change. And of course, the destruction of ecosystems itself in turn fuels the climate crisis. So we can't tackle the climate crisis without protecting and restoring nature. And that's why it is a double emergency. We need to be working on these in tandem.
And I understand that the report doesn't mean 69% of animals altogether have been wiped out. It has more to do with the decline of certain animals, and then you kind of average those percentages, right?
Yes, exactly. And even when you look at the trends in the various regions, so it has, for example, Latin America and Caribbean as high as 94% since 1970, Africa 66%, Asia Pacific 55%, and then North America 20%, and Europe and Central Asia at 18%. But when you're looking at these trends, it's important to remember that the status of biodiversity was different among these different regions at the baseline year, which is 1970. So in Europe and North America, for example, biodiversity had already been depleted by 1970. And so our areas that have been subject to human impact more recently, such as the tropical regions of Latin America, Africa, and Asia Pacific, are the ones that are showing really steeply declining trends in the time frame.
And speaking of Africa, the report said that indigenous people in Africa are particularly hard hit by the decline in certain animals. Why is that?
Well, indigenous people are the ones that live closest to these habitats, whether it's protected areas, whether it's the wildlife, and of course, by when you have this increased destruction of nature, their lives are affected. I mean, in Africa, for example, 70% of our populations are dependent on nature for their livelihoods, and indigenous people even more so, because they live near these forests or near these parks, and they access them for food, they access them for all of their livelihoods, and or even their religious practices. So yes, they are hard hit when nature is destroyed. The human cost to them is even much higher. But to flip that also is the fact that there is also a lot of data showing that where indigenous people are, the land is better protected if we put in place better measures, because they've been stewards for this land for many years. For example, one of the species that is backing the trend in the report is the mountain gorillas in the Virunga ranges in the northern border of Uganda, DRC, and Rwanda. And this is an area that has been dealing with insecurity for many, many years. And yet the gorillas have increased from 480, I think, in 2010 to almost 1,000 today. And really, all that can be attributed to the governments of Uganda and Rwanda and even DRC putting in place agreements with those communities living near the parks, giving them incentives from tourism revenue, and engaging them in the management of the park and addressing issues like human wildlife conflict, but also enshrining these revenue sharing agreements into regulation so that these communities receive a share.
Aside from the mountain gorillas, the example that you just gave, was there any other good news in the report?
Yes, I think there was many good news. I mean, there were many examples, particularly when you look at communities and indigenous people taking the lead. We have examples of voices for just climate action in Uganda and Kenya, where we see communities taking the lead. We have examples of restoration, good examples there of conservation agriculture. We have good examples of multiple use landscapes in West Africa as well. There were several pockets of good things happening, but we need to take them to scale. So we need to do much more because the kind of action that is required needs a bigger ambition than having those few case studies, and that's why as we head into COP27, in which is the climate COP in Egypt, and in particular also as we head into Montreal to discuss this new global biodiversity framework, we are calling for a much more ambitious biodiversity framework that takes this action to scale and deals with issues like subsidy reform, deals with issues like unsustainable supply chains, deals with all of these big issues because we need more ambition. We need more ambition, and more importantly, we need a whole of society approach. We need an engaged society. We need to make this everybody's business. It can no longer be just the business of the conservation organizations. We need all hands on deck.